Chapter 15. Marriage and Motherhood. Ruth stood at the stone sink looking out of the window at the garden of the tiny stone cottage. In the little spare time he had after work, Wilfred had planted neat rows of carrots, onions, leeks and potatoes. There were runner beans growing up crossed stakes, their little red flowers a rare touch of colour in this edible garden, echoed by the blush of ripening tomatoes. On deep window-sills were trays of cress and jam jars filled with wild flowers she had picked from the meadow behind the house. When they were married in May 42, Sonia had pointed out that they wouldn't have a great deal of privacy at Micklepage. "What Wilfred needs is a job with a tied cottage," she told Ruth. "I saw an advertisement in the post office window last week for farm labourers on the Knepp Castle estate near West Grinstead. It's not far from here. You should get Wilfred to write to them." The application was duly sent, and Wilfred was taken on as a cowhand at Pondtail Farm. They moved into old Keeper's cottage on the estate. For the first time in her life, Ruth found herself mistress of her own home. There was nobody here to tell her what to buy or cook or how to spend her time. However, she had been well trained by Frau Klinkov in the years after she had left the children's home, and was a good manager even in those difficult times of shortages and rationing. She enjoyed rearranging the meagre furniture to better effect, and sewing patches of cotton cut from worn-out dresses to make bright cushion covers. She stuck pictures to the walls. Even if they were only old birthday or Christmas cards, they cheered the place up and made it her own. Now, with her hands in grey soapy suds, she was scrubbing at grass stains on a cotton blouse she had worn yesterday on her walk. Always a dreamer, she had lain in the long grasses of the meadow, watching the poppies, cowslips and dog daisies nodding against a cerulean sky, completely content for half an hour or so. Romantic lines from Schiller, her favourite poet, slipping easily into her mind. "Sie umschlungen Millionen, diesen Kuss der ganzen Welt. Be embraced, you millions, this kiss for the entire world." During such rare peaceful moments it was hard to remember that there was a bitter war being raged all over Europe. She remembered the imagined kiss she had sent to her brother, wherever he was, and fought back the terrible fear that he might be dead. The water was cooling, her skin white and puckered from being immersed in soapsuds for too long. She sighed, rinsed, and wrung out the blouse, placing it on top of the rest of the washing, waiting on the wooden draining board to be mangled before being put out on the line. It was a hot day. Everything should dry quickly. Wilfred was a vegetarian, and Ruth, after her experience of living with the Müllers above their food reform shop in Berlin, was very willing to give up eating meat. This actually worked out quite well for them. Vegetarians were given quite generous cheese rations to replace their meat ration, and agricultural workers, as well as industrial workers, were given extra cheese for their lunchboxes. Ruth, with imagination and skill, managed to make plenty of tasty and wholesome meals with the extra vegetables and eggs that were available to her. Soon the autumn harvest would bring plenty of fruit and hazelnuts for gathering from the hedgerows, riches to supplement their meagre diet, and provide produce for bottling for the winter months. The cottage was fairly primitive, and although quite generously proportioned for a worker's house, was on a remote spot on the estate. They were very poor, and yet for a young woman with a romantic temperament, it was, during summer months at least, quite an idyllic place. Surrounded by woods and fields, a haven of wild flowers, birds and insects, Ruth could lose herself in daydreams. Winter was a different matter. Wilfred came home along frozen rutted lanes by torchlight well after dark. He suffered with deep, painful cracks in his hands from spending days in icy fields and cold milking sheds. He had to wash his hands in freezing water before milking the cows. Nothing Ruth could do seemed to alleviate the sores on his hands that became worse and worse as the winter progressed. She had always looked forward to having children of her own and became pregnant for the first time. Joy soon changed to grief, however, when she miscarried early in the pregnancy. Old Keeper's Cottage had turned out to be a sad place for them. By December 42, they had had enough. Perching Sands Farm, about 9 miles away at Fulking near Henfield, was their next home, and another job as a farmhand for Wilfred. Here they lived for just 3 months. When Ruth found that she was pregnant again, they took the decision to return to the community at Micklepage Farm. I guess that in all probability Ruth felt the need to be closer to the other women for support, particularly Sonia, who not only could speak her own language if things went wrong again, but had experienced childbirth herself and would be a helpful advisor. It was while she was at quite an advanced state of pregnancy that she went shopping one day into Horsham, and during her visit there, while she was laden with heavy bags of shopping, there was an air raid. I found myself, big belly and all, pushed down onto the ground beside the Carfax bandstand by a concerned bystander. "Down you go, my dear, flat as you can now." "I thought I would lose you too then." The pregnancy progressed normally, however, and when her time came she was taken to the cottage hospital in Shoreham. There, after a long, hard labour, punctuated with air raids, I was born at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of Friday, September 24th, 1943. This is where Ruth's story becomes my story too. This is where Ruth becomes Mum, and I another daughter in that long line of daughters back through time. How that idea of a strong female blood connection into the human past haunts me. I was born at a time of heavy bombing. Air raids were common events on the south coast of England in 1943, a frightening time for the new mother and her baby. I'm told that every time there was a bomb blast, it had an unfortunate effect on the condition of my nappy. To this day, I find that low-flying aircraft of any kind make my heart beat a little faster, a residue, no doubt, from my very earliest days of life. In those days, new mothers remained in hospital for at least a week. For my mother, her hospital stay was a miserable experience. Although overjoyed at having her very own baby at last, she was ill-treated by staff and fellow patients. At 30 years of age, she was older than all of the new mothers in the maternity ward of the cottage hospital in Shoreham by Sea. Most of the young mothers had no chance of a visit from their husbands because their men were away fighting the war. Those women must have been constantly afraid for their husbands, and they took it out on the German woman who had the audacity to share a ward with them. My mother was not only a Jerry, but her husband, as a conscientious objector, was able to visit her regularly. The hatred and jealousy of the other women was an added emotional burden, while my mother's hormones were already making her feelings run high. It was an uncomfortable time for her. There must have been many times when she was weepy, and she got no sympathy from anyone, including the hospital staff. Mum found that she was unable to breastfeed, which was a great disappointment to her, and she had no support whatsoever from the nursing staff. When the sister did her ward rounds and the newborns were weighed, she would congratulate all the other mothers on the progress of their babies. But when I was weighed and had gained a little, the sister thought it quite acceptable to say to my mother, "Well, she has gained a bit, but it's no thanks to you, is it, Mrs. Green?" The day we went home to Micklepage must have been a great relief to her. My first months of life were spent living in a Christian community, truly a commune child, but many years before the hippie communes of the 1960s. I was christened Christina Ruth because Mum had no idea that Christina would be spelt that way. I changed the spelling of my name later when I found out that my mother had always assumed it would be written with a K. I preferred it that way myself. It felt more me somehow. It's a strange idea now, that of having been christened, as my parents had both totally lost their faith by the end of the war. My sister, born 4 years later, was never christened, and all our family are non-theists to this day. For the first 9 months after my birth, we continued living at Micklepage. In the following June, we moved to a flat over some shops in Parade Mansions at Angmering-on-Sea in Sussex. I believe my father got a job working at a tomato nursery at that time. My mother spent fine summer days on the flat sandy beach, and that is where I learned to walk. She told me that wherever she drew a line in the compacted sand, I would stop as if a real barrier had been constructed, unable to go any further until the line was smoothed away. On February the 13th, 1945, while my mother slept somewhere in Sussex with her 17-month-old baby daughter beside her, her hometown was burning in one of the most devastating firestorms of World War II. Many of the beautiful Baroque buildings, churches and palaces and elegant shops that she knew, as well as countless numbers of homes, were destroyed. The fire sucked oxygen from the air, creating a hot wind that swept through the city, destroying everyone and everything in its wake. Mum never said anything about how she had felt when she first heard that her beloved Dresden had been virtually destroyed by Allied bombings. Perhaps I never asked her. She must have been very afraid for her brother and other people she knew there. She later found out that the Klinkovs, living on a hill overlooking Dresden, had not been touched by bombs or fires. But they were witnesses, and even from that distance could feel the intense heat rising from firestorm that ravaged the city and killed thousands of people in one night. Mum had a bicycle with a baby seat for doing her shopping. I expect this gave her a feeling of freedom. Being able to ride must have made a wider area available to her. I have no anecdotes about that time, and just one from their next home in the village of Merrow, where they moved in 1946 after the war had ended. Their neighbours in Merrow were a couple with a little girl the same age as me. Naturally, we played together. But Mum, who had hoped to speak German to me, felt unable to speak to me in her mother tongue. She felt it would have been insensitive because the little girl's father had lost his legs to a German bomb during the war. It would not do, she thought, for me to start coming out with German words or nursery rhymes in front of her neighbours. My mother never told me how it was that she had got in touch with her brother Hans again. The Klinkovs would have been easy to contact after the war, as they still lived in the same house in Neulanderstrasse as when Mum had been their Haustochter. Perhaps they helped Mum to trace her brother. Perhaps Hans went to them in the hope that they could put him in touch with his sister. When the news of what had happened in the death camps reached her, she was appalled. Where was that loving God she had been brought up to believe in? How could such atrocities have been allowed to happen? After the war, she never again believed in any God. At that time, her thoughts must have been mostly of those she had known, particularly Hans Werner's parents and grandmother. But she also thought of her own father, that unknown Jew who was so intimately connected to her. There were so many Jewish deaths. Why would he have been spared? In 1946, Hans Werner was now a British subject under his new English name of Paul John Eames, chosen from his favourite character, Johnny Eames, in an English novel, A Small House at Allington, by Anthony Trollope. He was sent by British Army intelligence to Düsseldorf in Germany to interrogate German prisoners of war. My uncle Hans had returned from army duties in Holland and Russia and was rebuilding his life under the new communist regime in East Germany. It was a time for all of them to come to terms with the events of the past 6 years that had taken so many lives, and with the changes to the map of Europe that deeply affected families everywhere. It was a time to rebuild. In January 1947, Wilfred's father, Alfred Green, lent him the deposit so that he could buy his first house, and we moved to Sydenham in South London, not far from where my English grandparents lived. One of my first memories is of a terrible storm one day. It was probably the big storm of July 16th that year. The sky went as dark as night, and it rained so hard that our basement kitchen flooded. I remember sitting in a high chair with floodwaters rising around me and my mother panicking but trying to reassure me at the same time. We lived in the basement and ground floor of a Victorian end-of-terrace house and had lodgers upstairs, their rent helping to pay the mortgage. My father now worked in a drawing office, and although I don't remember it, I'm sure we had a garden in our London house, and I'm sure there would have been vegetables growing there to supplement the rationing that was still with us for years after the war. Money was always short. There must have been an undercurrent of atmosphere about it that I vaguely remember. Mum stayed at home all day, as many women did, but her skill as a needlewoman gave her the opportunity to earn a little pocket money of her own. She made dresses for little girls, stitched with the most beautiful smocking and embroidered detail. For these she was paid a pittance, but the shop she sold them to would display the dresses in their window with a hefty price tag. She only did it for a short time. She couldn't bear being ripped off by the shopkeeper. After that, she just used to make clothes for me from cut-down dresses and blouses of her own. Because of her skill and taste, I always had lovely dresses to wear. My father's parents, Alfred and Elsie, lived in a semi-detached house at 7 Brockley Park, Forest Hill, in south-east London. It had brown paint, beige wallpaper, and heavy dark furniture in most of the rooms. As a child, I imagined that they were very grand and quite rich, which was not really the case. They were, I would say, comfortably situated. What I liked most about their house were the clocks. There was a large pendulum clock hanging in the hall above the little mahogany table on which stood a shiny chrome gong held by a sylph-like Art Deco figure. This gong was struck at mealtimes, and as a child I loved it when my grandmother gave me the responsibility of banging it to announce dinner. The clock ticked with a satisfyingly loud clunk at every swing of its heavy pendulum. My grandfather would wind the clock by pulling on the chain once a day. On the dining room mantelpiece was another clock that always had a fluffy brown wren sitting on top of it. This clock sang the Westminster chimes on every quarter hour, and I remember that when I slept at their house I would try to stay awake that extra quarter hour just to hear the next chime. I don't think I often managed it. My grandfather was an engineering draftsman like my father. He was an elder of the local church and a Freemason. He always sat on the left of the fireplace in the dining room, in a large wing chair in which he often fell asleep. He smoked a pipe of sweet-smelling tobacco. To this day I sometimes get a whiff of pipe tobacco, and that reminds me of my granddad. He spent a long time cleaning and filling his pipe, and was constantly relighting it, sucking soft gurgling sounds as he drew air into its brown bowl. On the mantelpiece was a leather pot with a selection of pipes, pipe cleaners, and paper spills. The smell of his pipe lingered in the wool of his jacket, even when he wasn't smoking. When I was very small, he would bounce me on his knee while singing The Galloping Major, or This is the Way the Ladies Ride. I always felt a bit shy of him, though, and felt the need to be terribly polite when in his company. I wasn't aware of it then, but he was quite unkind to my mother when my parents first married. It was hard enough for him to forgive his son for not joining the army, but much harder to forgive him for marrying a German woman. Strangely, my mother rather liked her father-in-law in spite of this, and I wonder if she was drawn to him because she didn't have a father of her own. Grandad's passion was gardening. There was a garden at the front of the house, bordered by a wooden fence and gate, that in winter smelt slightly of some sort of preservative that he used once a year. Perhaps it was creosote. I loved that smell. But in summer the garden became a heady cocktail of perfumes from his lavender hedge, roses and other fragrant plants. He knew how to mix scents and colours to perfection. The back garden was very long, extending back from the house so far that these days it would probably be sold off for development and would be big enough to accommodate several modern houses. There was a small lawn bordered with shrubs close to the house, with a stone bird bath at its centre. This was where, on summer days, we sometimes enjoyed a ritual called tea on the lawn. Behind that, a few steps led up to the rest of the garden. I wish I knew what variety of apples and pears Grandad had in that garden. Right at the very far end there was a massive old pear tree that seemed to be laden with small, delicious pears every year. There were bushes of soft fruit too. I'm sure Grandma never had to buy fruit during the summer. We were never allowed to pick any for ourselves, though, and from autumn the garage at the side of the house was filled with the warm smell of ripe apples. Grandad would wrap each perfect apple in newspaper, and they were set on the shelves that lined the garage walls to keep for the winter. They had plenty of good fruit, but my parents and I were only allowed the windfalls that were left in the bucket outside the back door. My grandmother had standards and liked things to be dainty. I can imagine what John Betjeman would have made of her cruets and serviettes. I had to laugh when I first read his poem, How to Get On in Society. It was such a perfect description of the way Grandma arranged things. When we went for tea, the first rule was that we had to eat plain bread with butter before we got anything else. I had no complaints with that. Her method of buttering and slicing bread meant that the slices were wafer thin. The bread was white and soft, and the butter salty. This was a great treat, because we never had white bread at home. She would butter the loaf, and then, holding it against her body, would cut slices by drawing a sharp bread knife towards herself. Tea usually consisted of thin cucumber sandwiches, bowls of wilting lettuce leaves and sliced tomatoes, Heinz salad cream, and plates with thin slices of rubbery ham, cheddar cheese, and a bowl of pickled onions, or sometimes thinly sliced vinegary beetroot. When she was satisfied that we had done justice to all her savoury food, she would clear the table and bring on a tray of individual jellies in cut glass dishes from the sideboard and a jug of evaporated milk. Then there was cake, always homemade and usually Victoria sponge, a special treat because I rarely saw cake at home. My mother said that when I went to Grandma's for tea, when I was a toddler, I would immediately point to the cake, carefully arranged on a lacy doily, and say, "Keek, keek." I soon learned that cake was the very last part of the meal. It was all a ritual that had to be followed to the letter. Grandma had a daily woman coming in to do her housework. This was another reason why I thought she was rather grand. Milly had worked for her for many years, but still always called her Mrs. Green, and was very subservient. Grandma always kept her distance from her daily, and I was not supposed to be too familiar with Milly either. I think my mother found this very embarrassing. After all, it was not so many years since she herself had been doing housework for other people. She always made a special effort to be friendly to Milly. I remember being most impressed with the sound system that my grandfather had organised in their house in such a way that while my grandfather was listening to the home service on the big wooden wireless in the front parlour, my grandmother could hear it through speakers rigged up in the kitchen. As a child, this seemed to me to be the greatest luxury and very advanced technology. Grandma's kitchen was small. She had a built-in dresser that had been painted cream, but the paint had become chipped and now showed old green layers of paint from earlier times. There was a scrubbed wooden table that always seemed to have a pile of papers and magazines cluttering its surface, even when Grandma was preparing food on it. In one corner there was a black solid fuel stove hung with drying tea towels, and an enamelled gas oven on legs beside a yellow stone sink with a wooden draining board. That sink was set so low that even I, as a child, could easily reach into it. Mum always thought this was one of the reasons that as she got older, Grandma developed a severe stoop. I can recall exactly the smell and texture of that old draining board, slightly slimy from years of soap suds. In the corner of the kitchen was a larder cupboard where Grandma kept the cake and biscuit tins and homemade pies and setting jellies. I can still bring to mind the smells from Grandma's larder and the click of the door catch when it shut. My grandparents were very English, a fact that I was always aware of, probably because of the very foreignness of my mother.